I normally talk about archaeology in these sessions, and there'll be a bit of archaeology along the way. But how is it that the two most important figures to Jesus, and I mean this historically, I think the two people who meant the most to him have become the most forgotten and lost and marginalized in terms of subsequent Christian history? How did that happen? I'm talking about John the Baptizer, of whom Jesus said, among those born of women, there's none greater than John. And I think a scribe later talked to Bart Ehrman about this, parenthetically added, because that's such a shocking statement, right? For Jesus, being born of a woman, to say, among those born of women, there's none greater than John, giving allegiance to his teacher, the very one who baptized him. And a scribe added, I don't think this was original in the Q document, this is a Q source doc, but the least in the kingdom is greater than he. Which is, if you think about it, I don't think Jesus said that, because it makes the statement sort of nonsensical. Jesus had been asked, what about John? And he said, oh, you think he's a prophet? Prophet, that's pretty great. He goes, I tell you more than a prophet. Now, what's more than a prophet? Well, then he says, he is the voice crying in the wilderness, the one that's preparing the way and so forth. And then he says, among those born of women, there's none greater than John. And the other one is James, his own brother, to whom he left charge the community. And that's where I'm getting the notion of the Jesus dynasty. I used to call this the Jesus family. And it had nothing to do with Dan Brown, but I began to change because I really think it is a dynasty. There were 3 dynasties in antiquity, maybe 4, depending on how you count the Hashmonean dynasty. But Herod tried to start a dynasty, did he not? Why is Herod marrying a Hashmonean princess, right? A Maccabean princess, to try to get a sort of a little bit of royal blood going there? And he's only half Jewish himself, right? And then we've got the Julio-Claudian dynasty. That's Augustus the emperor, who puts on his deathbed Tiberius in charge. Well, Tiberius is not even related to him. He's the son of Livia by another man. He adopts Titus reluctantly. But you see how he's trying to get a dynasty. And then Tiberius dies. And you go to Caligula, who's a grandnephew, not even a bloodline relationship. And it goes on down through Claudius and Nero. So this idea of dynasties, the Herodian dynasty, the Roman emperors. And then if Jesus indeed, as I'm going to try to show you today, did in fact leave the community, what should we call them? Let's use the name that's in the book of Acts, the Nazarene community. This early Jewish sect of followers of Jesus, the Nazarene, we could call them in English the branchites, right? The people of the branch, because netzer, the branch, it's a sort of it's a way of saying messianists, really. So you have Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Nazarenes, and other groups as well, but those in particular we know quite a bit about. And if he left James, his own brother, in charge of the Nazarenes, that's not quite a dynasty unless we can trace it further, which I'll try to show you that I think we can do today. But what do we know about James? People today think of Peter and John and Paul, I think, as the leaders of the early church. And yet Paul himself, in the book of Galatians, I have this on your handout, but it's on the 3rd page, I think, but some of you will know this. Paul says that those so-called pillars of the church, right? And then he names them, James, Peter, and John, a kind of triumvirate of 3. James, Peter, and John. Who is this James that suddenly crops up? Out of the mouth of Paul, who's not speaking with the greatest respect. He said, the so-called pillars of the church, what they are means nothing to me, because he claimed to hear directly from Jesus, last but not least, as he says. But before him, in terms of what Jesus apparently left behind, we have James, who no one ever talks about, the brother of Jesus. And Paul calls him James, the Lord's brother, if you have any doubt about James. So we sort of have to get our Jameses straight starting out. So if you look at the top of your page, first page there of the handout, the brothers of Jesus are clearly listed in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark is our earliest gospel, I'm convinced, and Matthew follows Mark. And notice they're listed in the order James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Pretty common names. By the way, very popular in Galilee with people who sympathize with revolution, and they're essentially what we call Hashmonean names. That is, they come from the family of the Maccabees. If you look at your different ossuaries that are found, these names, when we find these names, particularly Simon and Judas, they show that the families are naming their children with these popular names. Maybe you've heard of Judas the Galilean that led the revolt. And these names run through the period among certain families. But anyway, those are the brothers of Jesus. Now, on the back page, if you just, not the back page, but the back of that page, this is actually from Herschel Shanks's book that he did with Ben Witherington. But it's a nice chart, and it's a good book. I hope you haven't decided completely to give up on the James ossuary. I'm one of the few remaining, I guess, textual scholars, and I don't have any kind of scientific expertise to say this, but I'm not at all convinced that the James ossuary is a forgery. My sense is that it's very likely authentic, and I hope that gets vindicated. And I'll try to connect that a little bit to the story of James here. But one of the questions we have, you see these four options here? Are they full brothers? Are they half brothers? Are they step brothers? Are they cousins? Why would this be a problem? We read in Mark, Jesus, Mary, and his brothers. It's a problem because of the teaching of the perpetual virginity of Mary, as it was called. Mary, ever virgin. That if Mary has Jesus as her firstborn son, does she actually have other children? And so there develops within the Orthodox Eastern and Western Catholic Church two basic theories. One is that they're brothers from a previous wife, that Joseph marries Mary, right? The chart's complicated, so listen to me and you'll follow. Joseph marries Mary, but he comes to the marriage with children from a previous marriage. That's simple. So what would they be? Stepbrothers, right? Sort of. Or the other position, which was taken by some early Christians, you see the explanation at the bottom, is that that there's a person named Clophas, a mysterious kind of missing person, only mentioned once in the Gospel of John, Clophas, and that he's married to a Mary, and he has these children. So you see these children, James, Joseph, Simon, Jude, and then the two girls, Salome and Mary. Now, the idea there is that Joseph has a brother named Clophas, which I think he actually did. There's good evidence for that in our early records. So they wouldn't be Joseph's children. This view was very favored in the West because there grew up the idea that even Joseph needs to always be a virgin. He doesn't need to be coming to the marriage with 4 children. He's got to be as holy as Mary. And sex is seen as a mark of humanity, a mark of earthiness, a mark of this world rather than the other world. And so if we're going to emphasize salvation in the other world, we tone down the body and tone down sexuality. It's a very non-Jewish move, I think you would agree, because the Torah begins with the first commandment, the very first mitzvah of the Torah, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? And so within Judaism, generally speaking, an unmarried person is an anomaly and maybe even seen as a negative thing that for whatever reason somebody did not fulfill their full human potential of having children. But if you're talking about the mother of God and the man who married the mother of God, you see, theology begins to come in. And so there's the idea, well, Joseph had a brother named Clophas, which I think he did. And so maybe those 4 children actually it's 6, but I'm talking about the 4 brothers. Maybe they're from an uncle, and therefore they're cousins of Jesus, you see? And so you get that possibility. Well, I explore a different possibility in the book, and I'm not dogmatic about it because I don't know for sure. But there is something very interesting about this Clophas person. Look on the first page again. Of these 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, at the crucifixion and burial of Jesus, Mark and Matthew, Luke doesn't tell any names, by the way. I'll get to that in a minute. But the one thing Luke doesn't want to tell you, either in the Gospel of Luke or Acts, is much about the family of Jesus. You know that? Did you notice the names of the brothers there? Matthew and Mark. Luke doesn't say anything about the names of the brothers. And so even at the crucifixion, he says, some women from Galilee were there. Oh, some women. Wonder who? How about his own mother? And perhaps this other Mary and so forth. So we get a list in Mark and Matthew. Mary Magdalene was there. She's solid. No doubt about her. She's there. This is at the cross as Jesus is dying. Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. Notice the name, Joseph. It's a nickname. Shimon Gibson helped to excavate an ossuary, a tomb south of Jerusalem in a place called Talpiot that we're sort of interested in right now. And you did this back in 1980, I think, right? Oddly enough, there is an ossuary there. Well, it's got a Mary and a Joseph and so forth, but the Joseph is Yosei. It's actually this very name. It's kind of a nickname. It's almost like saying Josie or something in English. But notice at the cross is Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, or Joseph, Matthew says, and Salome. So we've got 3 women, 2 Marys, and a Salome. Now, I don't know if the Salome is the mother of the sons of Zebedee or possibly Jesus' sister. It's definitely a family affair, I think, right? But if you go to John, you get an interesting little switch. You see here, John 19:25. It says, at the cross was his mother Mary, and Mary, the wife of Clophas, the sister of Mary, and Mary Magdalene. No Salome mentioned. So John's got 2 Marys. And what I argue or propose in the book is that this Mary, wife of Clophas, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. I'm not the first one to say that. Other people have said it. Now, there should be no problem for Jews with this. In fact, it would be required in Judaism. But if Joseph dies childless, who knows what's supposed to happen according to Jewish law? Let's assume Joseph is not the father of Jesus. We won't get into the father of Jesus right now. But let's say Joseph is not the father. The brother. And if he has a brother named Clophas, what would Mary do? She would be married to Clophas, the brother, who would raise up the 6 children. Now, think about this. To an Orthodox Christian or even a pious Roman Catholic Christian, that sort of thing. We're talking about the Virgin Mary. To have sex at all is enough, but 2 men? What are you doing, Tabor? Well, I'm actually trying to honestly read the text. And I do think Joseph had a brother named Clophas. And what are the chances that 2 brothers would marry the same woman named Mary and have children with the same 4 names and sisters with the same names? That's what if you don't think they're from Mary, do you see what you're left with? You're left with his brother Clophas happening to marry a woman named Mary. John says her sister. So let's back up a little. Joachim and Anna, the parents of Mary, had 2 girls, Mary and Mary. Let's name them both Mary. And they married brothers, right? I'm being facetious here. And they said, well, what are we going to name our kids? And Mary named her kids Jesus, James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude. And the other Mary, her sister Mary, who had married the brother of Joseph, picked the same names. I think it's very unlikely. If you just sort of do this move, Mary, the wife of Clophas, is the mother of Jesus. And everything fits. So suggest this in the book. If that's the case, keep that in mind, then as we go to what happened in terms of the Jesus dynasty, we get some interesting possibilities. Now, let's go to the third page, which is your second staple page. Go to James the Just. That family business was just sort of the background to get the name straight, because it is a little complicated in terms of these names. In 1945, or was it 46? It's disputed, but I think 45 is the date we now go by. The Gospel of Thomas was dug up at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, right, in Upper Egypt, in a field. The story is a fertilizer field, and it was a collection of documents, sometimes called Gnostic documents, but the Gospel of Thomas in particular just riveted the attention of New Testament scholars because it was a collection of the sayings and teachings of Jesus. 100 or so sayings and teachings of Jesus that reminded us of what we imagine might be the case with this mysterious Q source. See, we don't have Q. You've heard of when you say the Q source, you're saying the source. But the Q source, we don't really have that source, but we think it was a collection, about 200 verses of sayings of Jesus that Matthew and Luke had, and we try to recover it. Well, here we have a gospel of the sayings of Jesus, and saying number 12 is of particular interest for this topic that we're dealing with now. What an extravagant statement. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know you will leave us. Who is going to be our leader then?" And Jesus said to them, "No matter where you go, you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but if you haven't, I hope it sort of knocks you off your chair. I don't think Jesus said that. I think it's very unlikely that that's a verbatim quote from Jesus. I'm not sure that much in the Gospel of Thomas is verbatim, but I do think it reflects a tradition of this apostolic community. Some of the people now working on the Gospel of Thomas are tracing it back to what we call Jewish Christianity, Jerusalem-based Jewish Christianity that later gets Gnosticized in Egypt. But in terms of those rooted traditions, there's a new book coming out by April DeConnick. She's one of our bar lecturers. She was any of you at Chicago with Bart and I? Okay, you heard April. She's doing this wonderful work on the Gospel of Thomas. I think the best work that's out there. And she is tracing this collection back to earliest Palestinian Jewish Christianity, and she's got some really good linguistic evidence for that and so forth. So I asked her about this. I said, well, saying 12, I'm really interested in for obvious reasons. Go to James the Just, for whom heaven and earth came to be. Not Peter, not Paul, not John, but to James. And that fits with and comports with what Paul said, the so-called pillars of the church, as he calls them, James, Peter, and John, you see. So where's that coming from? And she said that this community remembers James as their leader. That's what this saying is reflecting. That they're looking back and they're thinking of James as the leader. Now, if you read the New Testament, you wouldn't immediately pick that up. But if you already knew it and read it carefully, you would pick it up. And it has to do with Luke not wanting to put it on the front burner, frankly. Who's Luke's hero? Paul, right? By Acts chapter 9, I mean, you got Peter in 10 and 11, but barely. By Acts chapter 9, Acts has what, 24 chapters? By chapter 9, it's Paul, and he ends at Rome, right? Preaching the gospel, his gospel. Well, what happened to the original early Jewish Christian movement of Jerusalem? Luke wrote, we think, in the 80s or 90s. James was killed in the year 62. Paul abruptly stops his story with Paul in Rome in the year 60. And then it's like, well, that's it. But that's not it. Paul got out of prison, we think. He did some more traveling, and James was martyred. And that was such a great event, as we're going to see, that even Josephus notes it. And considers it a very pivotal event. But Luke, it's not that he's falsifying, it's that he's de-emphasizing. See, he believes that Paul essentially, as the apostle to the Gentiles, should be the one we're focusing on, because he took the message to the world. And we have mostly letters from Paul in the New Testament, do we not? I mean, 14 letters, 13 I think attributed to him, and some people want to put in Hebrews and so forth. Paul is so dominant. And if you add Acts, which is a very thick book, with all of Paul's letters, you're getting up to 50% of the New Testament is directly about Paul and so forth. So what happens to James if he was the leader? Well, in Acts chapter 1, verse 13, you have the account of Luke where the 12 are gathered in the upper room. Notice the order, though. I put it in italics. Peter and John listed first now. Luke knows something. No other list does this. All the other lists always put Peter, Andrew, James, and John. You do it by brothers. Peter, his brother Andrew, 2 fishermen, James and John. This is not James, the brother of Jesus. This is James the fisherman. He dies in Acts 12 in the 40s AD. So think of James the fisherman versus James the brother of Jesus. They're not the same James. It's a common name. So Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, and Matthew. And then you have those last ones. Judas Iscariot's dead, right? So you've got James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas, the brother of James. Now, I want you to notice 2 things about that list, because Luke knows something here. First of all, he puts Peter first and then John. He doesn't put James at all, and yet James is supposed to be in charge of things. But at the end, he puts James, the son of Alphaeus. Now, the word Alphaeus in Greek is the same as Clophas. It's the Hebrew word chalaf, to change, to exchange. It's with a chet in Hebrew. We find it in inscriptions and so forth. In fact, there's a pillar at Capernaum, some of you've seen, right by the Peter house, and it traces some 2nd century names, and one of them is Clophas, spelled in Aramaic with the chet. So you can hear it. I know in English it sounds like Alphaeus, Clophas. What's the connection? But look at the consonants. See, it's Chalphaeus, not Alphaeus. Cha, hear it? K, kind of a ch, o, l, and then the f sound. Chalaf. I think it's a nickname. It's also used in the Talmud for rabbis who replace other rabbis. This guy, Clophas, replaced Joseph as husband. So what's his nickname? Chalaf, or Clophas, or Alphaeus. Well, if this is James, the son of Clophas or Alphaeus, and then we got Simon the Zealot, whoever he might have been. Wait a minute, Jesus had a brother named Simon, didn't he? And then we've got Judas, the brother of James, not the fisherman, but this James, then he's the son of Alphaeus too. We got 3 of the brothers right here in the 12. Is that possible? Well, according to Luke, it's not, because he goes on to say, next verse, all these, the 11, I put the 11, it doesn't say that, were constantly devoting themselves to prayer together with certain women. There's his certain women that he had used earlier, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. So he's going to tell you that they're there, but he doesn't make it clear that they're part of the 12. I think that, maybe you've never even thought of this. The brothers of Jesus, part of the 12, they're always listed as the last 4. See, they're not in the top tier. But the names match, and the paternity matches, and I really think you can make an argument that they are part of the 12. Now, in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of the Hebrews that Jerome quotes, they know this. They have James at the Last Supper. Well, who's at the Last Supper? Jesus and the 12, right? And there are other traditions in the apostolic constitutions and some of our early 4th century texts. They have no problem putting James at the Last Supper. And so it's just how we finally got the story. No, but there was a program a few years ago that Ray Bruce, a friend of ours, did a documentary or 2 for us. It was on the apostles of Jesus. So he had a program on Peter and a program on Paul and, whole hours. And he finally got down to the last three. And he said, Tabor, could you help us with this James, Simon, and Jude, not Judas Iscariot, but the other Jude. We don't have a single bit of information. We got to do an hour program on them. Why is there nothing about them? There's really a lot about them if they're the brothers of Jesus. Just watch, hold on. I mean, there's a whole lot about them. But if Luke in his list doesn't put them at the front, you tend to put them at the front, right? Now remember, Paul put James first and then Peter and John. Luke has Peter, John, and James at the bottom. Think about it. Now, in the community rule, this is Dead Sea Scrolls. Interesting that they have organized what they call their council, the council of the Yachad, or the community. There will be 12 men with 3 priests perfectly versed in the revealing, that is all that's revealed in the Torah. So they have this kind of organization of 3 and 12, and the 3 probably being part of the 12. And that appears to be what's going on in the Christian community as well. It would make sense. They have a lot in common with certain practices we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have a council of 12, and of that 12 would be 3 that are the most prominent. So what do we find with Jesus? There's a council of 12, and of that 12, 3, James, Peter, and John, kind of come to the forefront. Now, in Acts 15, Luke sort of drops the other shoe. He hasn't told you, he said Mary and the boys were at the meeting, right? Okay, but he doesn't say who was in charge or who was the leader. But in Acts 15, a critical decision is made. It's the most critical decision in the history of the early Christian movement. What are you going to do with the Goyim? What are you going to do with the Gentiles? Because Gentiles are getting attracted to this movement. And there was one wing of the movement that said, well, they could just convert to Judaism. What's the problem? Circumcision for males, the mikveh, that'll solve everything. We can all be one. But there was a significant group, including Paul and James and Peter, who said, no, that's not really required even in Judaism. Some of you who are Jews know, and some of you not Jews know, about the 7 laws of Noah. It's a rabbinic tradition, but the idea is not just rabbinic. It's that among the nations, non-Jews, are the righteous of the nations, the righteous Gentiles. But they're not obligated to follow Judaism as a full faith, but they do take on the basic moral obligations of Judaism, right? Don't commit adultery, don't commit murder, don't steal, and so forth. The Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 laws of the children of Noah in the Talmud. Here James stands up at the end of the deliberations. James, I got to remind you, this is completely out of the blue. You're reading through Acts, chapters 1 all the way through 14. Nothing about James, not even named, and he hadn't been named in Luke's gospel either. So he does not exist. And then it suddenly says, and James stood up and said, my decision is. My decision is, who are you? And notice in Greek, he says it very deliberately. It's this ego krino. I have decreed. It's sort of a rabbinic decree. And what he decided was that you not trouble the Gentiles who are turning to God. If they, as Paul said, if they turn to God from idols to serve a living and true God, that's the essential step of conversion for a Gentile. To turn from the Greco-Roman deities to the one God of Israel, and to live a basic ethical life. That's all that's required. So James goes along with this. I don't want to get into that as much as who makes the decision. This mysterious character, James. So Luke leaves that in. I think it is historically probable that James was in fact left in charge. Luke knows that, he just doesn't want to emphasize it. But he doesn't deny it. In fact, he says it here. He just doesn't put it at the front and say, oh, yes, there were 3, James, Peter, and John, and so forth. Now look at Clement of Alexandria, one of our early sources preserved by Eusebius. This is really interesting. Bottom of the page. Peter, James, and John. There we have it. Here's someone who isn't particularly worried about putting James up front, because I think it was well known in early Christianity that James was in charge. Paul knew it. Isn't it interesting that Clement names the same Peter, James, and John after the ascension, did not struggle for glory because they'd previously been given honor by the Savior. Now this is Peter and the fishermen, James and John. But they chose James the just as overseer of Jerusalem. After the resurrection, the Lord gave the tradition of knowledge to James the just and John and Peter. These gave it to the other apostles, and the other apostles to the 70. So what you've got is a tiered organization of 3, James the brother of Jesus, and you see how Clement says, not James the fisherman. He didn't promote himself. He said, in fact, let's put in Jesus' brother first. And then he drops out, really, and we get the list of John and Peter, the same list that we have, in fact, in Paul, James, Cephas, and John. And then the 12, the rest of the 12, I'm going to say the rest of the 12, and then the 70. Now, who are the 70? Jesus had appointed another group of 70 the last year of his work before his death. And it was a final push. Herod had killed John the Baptist, and I think Jesus is expecting the kingdom to just arrive at any moment. So he sends forth 2 by 2 into all the villages of Galilee, particularly Galilee, this kind of blitzkrieg gospel movement. And he tells them to, same thing he told the 12 the year before, go into all the villages and cities and tell them the kingdom of God is near, and anoint the sick and cast out demons and so forth. It was sort of a revival movement. Those 70 become a kind of Sanhedrin. I think you're ahead of me here, right? They become a kind of Nazarene Sanhedrin. They're referred to in the book of Acts as the elders. So you have the pillars of the church, James, the brother of Jesus, John and Peter, the 12, the rest of the 12, and then the 70. And together they make judgments. And even in the book of Acts, you don't name 70, but he does say, it pleased the whole assembly, including the apostles and the elders. They're called the elders. It's quite a large number, but we think the movement numbered in the thousands, right, from the book of Acts, 3,000, 5,000. So to have 70 that are sort of sitting as a council, I think makes sense. So what are they actually setting up? They're setting up a government. There is the king or ruler, first Jesus, and then he's gone, James takes over. And then you have the 12 sitting on, quote, 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And then you have the 70 as a sort of council of elders. It's definitely a government in exile, or I shouldn't say in exile, it's a government that has not yet been empowered. But they do believe they'll be empowered when the Son of Man comes in the clouds of heaven and gives glory and power, according to Daniel 7, to the saints of the Most High, who will then depose the other dynasties, including Herod's and Rome. So we got a competition of dynasties. This dynasty is not taking up arms, as far as I can tell. You know, in contrast to, say, Judas the Galilean, who broke into the armory at Sepphoris at the death of Herod in 4 BC, and got some weapons and got a group together and started pillaging around Galilee till the Romans came in and crushed him. Remember, they brought down a couple legions from Syria and crucified 2,000 people. That's how you normally deal with messianic usurpers, right? During Josephus tells quite a few accounts. The Jesus group is not, I don't think, storing arms. I can't agree with Brandon. I think Brandon, you know Brandon's book, Jesus the Zealot. I learned a lot from it. But when you really get down to it, I think this group expected a supernatural move on the part of God, you know, who would miraculously bring about legions of angels and earthquakes and, you know, how do you depose Herod in the palace over in western Jerusalem on the western hill? A good earthquake would be nice to level that palace. And what did Jesus talk about? Not one stone will be left upon another and so forth, even though it ended up being Titus and Vespasian. Just this idea that not that we're going to do it, but God will do it. We're waiting for the Son of Man to come in the clouds of heaven, and then we'll be empowered. But it's still no less a government. It's a government that believes they're going to take over the whole world. So they do have some fairly high ambitions, do they not? To a rational historian, that's a pretty big apocalyptic fantasy. But to a true believer, it's in fact what God has promised and what Jesus himself taught. And of course, it's what many Christians still believe today, that God will intervene and put God's people in power. Now, Hegesippus, turn the page. Hegesippus. Who's Hegesippus? He's a 2nd century Jewish Christian. And we don't have his works, but fortunately we have Eusebius. Eusebius doesn't like the kind of things that I'm saying, but, you know, he's honest enough to quote things that even go against his own position often. I think he wants to show you that he's got good early sources. Sometimes he paraphrases them, and then you think, oh, well, we don't know then. Because, you know, is he really telling you what they said? But other times he says, well, let me quote at length. And then he starts quoting the source. So we actually get the source, even if it kind of goes against, because he's with Constantine, right? He's much later. Even if it goes against his orthodoxy, he thinks, well, that's water under the bridge. We're talking about what happened early on, right? James is long gone. Now, what does he say? Hegesippus, 2nd century Jewish Christian, says, the succession of the church passed to James, the brother of the Lord, together with the apostles. He is called the just by all men from the Lord's time until ours, since many are called James, but he was holy from his mother's womb. So he essentially confirms, you see, we have, before this quote, we have it from Clement, and then we have it kind of hinted at in Acts, hinted at in Paul, but nobody really said, how did they do this and what happened? And he says that they got together like Clement and chose James. And then we have another source. This is a Jewish Christian source. It's 4th century. It's late. But it preserves some material, we think, from the 2nd century. It's called the Recognitions, the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions. Notice the warning here. Because Pauline Christians and other kinds of Christians are running around, and this group, known as Ebionites, who are keeping the Torah, the Jewish law, as Jews, and teaching Gentiles to observe the laws of Noah, and essentially are orienting themselves still as a Jewish group, not a non-Jewish group. They're behind this document. They say, wherefore observe the greatest caution that you believe no teacher unless he bring from Jerusalem the testimonial of James the Lord's brother, or of whoever so may come after him. That sounds like a dynasty, at least a succession. Listen to James and listen to the one who's put in place after James. Don't, let that be your way of checking things. At this point in history, there are so many voices out there. How are you going to know the true voice? Now, Paul is hearing a voice. It's a heavenly voice. He says, we no longer know Jesus after the flesh. Well, Paul probably never knew Jesus after the flesh. He might have seen him, but he certainly wasn't taught by him. So he's equating the revelation, the heavenly revelation he had, with the revelation of Jesus directly to the apostles themselves, including his own brother. Now, Christians have been comfortable with that. It's sort of almost a one-upmanship. There's a sort of a supersessionism here. Would you rather hear from those Jewish apostles who only were with the earthly Jesus? Or would you rather hear the heavenly, advanced, latest word from Jesus through Paul? And millions of Christians since have said, Paul, right? I trust Paul. Well, whether you trust Paul or not, I want you to know that in the first 200 years of the movement, it wasn't that simple. People had to make a choice. And many of them said, if someone has a vision, that's one thing. They say they heard this or they saw that. But if someone was actually touched by the Lord and felt him, as John says, and, just the Word made flesh, had that direct connection. There was a whole wing of the church, later called the Ebionites. They didn't call themselves that, I don't think, but their enemies did, that said, we won't accept Paul over James. It wasn't like James. There were wings of the Ebionites, I think, that completely trashed Paul, but that's not necessary to still give James a certain priority. And so here you have the Pseudo-Clementines stating that. Now, Josephus tells us about the death of James. We've got several accounts of the death of James, but I think Josephus's is the best because he's not giving the theology, and he's not giving these legendary accounts. Hegesippus, for example, and Epiphanius and Clement all tell us about the death of James. Some of it might be historical, but frankly, it begins to sound very, very legendary. This is a very sober account about Annas. Now, let me say something about Annas, very interesting. Who presided over the trial of Jesus? Caiaphas, who's the high priest, but what's his father-in-law's name? Annas. This is old Granddaddy Annas, who has 5 sons in power during the first century, and 1 son-in-law, Caiaphas. He's the real power. He himself had been high priest in the early years of the first century, and then one by one he puts his sons in. Josephus says that this particular Annas, he's a son of Annas, so Annas, son of Annas. You also see him as Ananus. It's actually the Hebrew word Hanan, which means the gracious one, which is very questionable. Josephus says he was more cruel than all others in judgment, and then he kind of takes a slam at the Sadducees. Like most Sadducees, he was rather heartless, he says. But then he says that he convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, and some others on the accusation of breaking the law, and delivered them to be stoned. And those inhabitants of the city who were considered the most fair-minded and who were strict in observance of the law were offended at this. Now, those are just a few lines, but boy, do they tell us a lot. One of the things they tell us is that the same group that killed James killed Jesus, and probably for the same reasons. Jesus was an economic and social threat to the temple establishment. He wanted to be a threat to the whole Roman establishment, but that would come later if God, backed him. But he went into the temple. He declared the temple system to be corrupt. He called it a den of robbers, as Jeremiah had done, and so forth. Got himself arrested and killed. This is the same family. I'm going to call it the mafia. This is the mafia group that control things all through the first century. The Talmud curses this group. Woe to you, Cathros, who was another member in between, and mentions also Caiaphas by name. And so these priests were remembered to be scoundrels. And clearly James is some sort of a threat. But Josephus says that the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who were considered fair-minded and strict in observance of the Torah, were offended at this. And then we have another quotation from Josephus that's not in our text. But remember, our text is passed on by Christian copyists who maybe aren't so interested in emphasizing James, other than the brother of Jesus. But according to 2 sources, Eusebius and Origen, Josephus went on to say the following: "And these things happened to the Jews to avenge James the Just, who is the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. For the Jews killed him in spite of his great righteousness." Now, I don't know if Josephus said that or not, but I do know that Eusebius and Origen both said, that's in my copy of Josephus. And normally they don't just make those sort of things up wholesale. Both of them are pretty textually based. Hegesippus says, what happened when James died? He says that the disciples and apostles of the Lord who were still alive came together from every place with those who were humanly speaking of the family of the Lord. Now that's something that you really wouldn't expect as you sort of imagine Christian origins from the standard perspective. We're in the year 62 AD. The Jewish-Roman War is going to break out, 66 or so. Times of great crisis and stress. James has been killed. John the Baptist was killed. Jesus was killed. The three great leaders of the movement are gone. So what do? We gather whoever's left and the family members of Jesus, specifically mentioned. For many of them were still alive, and they took counsel together as to whom they ought to consider worthy to succeed James. And all unanimously decided that Simon, the son of Clopas, was worthy of the throne. And it is the Greek word thronos in Greek. It just means chair. I won't overdo it. But there are other words for chair, and thronos means a seat of authority. So put it in, right? Simon, son of Clopas. Now, Hegesippus is a pious believer in the virginity of Mary, and he says, that's, by the way, the cousin of our Lord. You know, that he's not the brother. But what if he is the brother? Well, if he is the brother, then the Jesus dynasty becomes a kind of interesting story, a minor story that's been ignored, but that Jesus dies, his brother James takes over, and that James dies and Simeon takes over. According to the sources, he's around 100 years old or so. Well, actually not when he went in, but when he died later. He would be, let me just think real quick, he would probably be in his 70s at this point. He's an older person, and this is in 62. And then when he dies, we have an account of his death. We don't have a story of how they decided who would succeed him. But they put in one named Jude. Now, I want you to recall the names of the brothers of Jesus, right? James, Joseph, Jude, and Simon. And so Joseph is the only one not mentioned. Now, could it be that Simon dies at the advanced age of 100 under Trajan's reign, and there's still a younger brother old enough to take charge? I don't know. That's stretching it. He would be in his 90s for sure if this guy Jude is the brother of Jesus. But I think it's possible. And he is called the brother of Jesus in the apostolic constitutions. This same kind of they call it, it's the brother of Jesus. Well, that would really argue for the dynasty idea. They want a bloodline link. Not just because they're worshiping bloodline or anything like that, but I think it's this idea of fidelity. Who has really been from the start? Who knew Jesus? Who grew up in the same house with Jesus? Who saw him as a kid? Who heard him from the start, you see? And with all else going on by this time, because this is Trajan's reign, with lots of confusion as to who should we listen to and who should we go to, I could see the possibility they put in Jude. If it isn't Jude, the brother of Jesus, it could very likely be Jude, the son of James, a son, still of the same family, but that would solve the age problem. Then we have 12 other names. Now, these are named by Eusebius and Epiphanius as the 12 successors of James, Simon, and Jude. But he says, I'm listing them up through Hadrian. Do you know Hadrian, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135? Now, what are the chances that James ruled to 62, Simon got in and ruled to about 110, Jude got in and ruled I don't know how long, and then 12 other guys ruled from 110 to 135? What are they coming in every year? Just bang, bang, bang? I don't think that's likely. I don't think Eusebius knows what this is. Look at the list. Pretty interesting list. Some of those names you don't know, right? Happens to be 12. Sounds to me like they're filling in, they're keeping that council of 12 filled in. See? And look at the last two names. We got Jose, same nickname, and a Judas. And we've also got a Matthew and a Philip, who could have been part of the 12, be pretty aged by this point. But Richard Bauckham suggested this, I think it's very persuasive, that this is not 12 successors of Jude, but it's essentially 12 names that have passed down as sort of the Holy Council, and to put them in at a certain year would be difficult. But in general, we've got 15 names taking us down to Bar Kokhba. And then we basically lose the story. Who succeeded Jude? Well, I think that Bar Kokhba rebellion, I know everybody focuses on the first revolt. It's interesting. It puts it more in the time of Jesus. But that second revolt, the horror of that second revolt, we don't have a Josephus, do we, to record it. But the Romans came in, and I'm sure Dr. Gibson could tell you something archaeologically about this. I mean, apparently, little Judea and Galilee, and particularly Judea, it was just utterly decimated. You could liken it almost to a Holocaust in that time. I don't mean that it's parallel to what the Nazis did systematically, but Hadrian did not expect to have the Jews ever raise their head again. And Jews were forbidden to even enter the city. So what happened to these original followers, this family-led group of Jesus' original followers? They dispersed into Jordan and up into the area of the Decapolis, as far as we know. They became known as Ebionites. I think they kind of became more rigid, perhaps. They lost a lot of their leadership. But the great church, the Orthodox Church, went on triumphantly in the West, basically following Paul. And then you got the succession of bishops of Rome and so forth, and you've got the controversy between the Quartodecimans in Asia and the Roman bishop. But by the 3rd, 4th century, there is the Holy Roman Catholic Church, right? And James is never mentioned, and Mary is a perpetual virgin, and the family is essentially left out. So what I want to do in this book is tell a story that I think is a more likely true story. I don't know everything, but I think I know something, and I think our sources tell us something. And that is that the 3 great lost figures to early Christianity are John the Baptizer, Jesus, and James, his brother, and to kind of rehabilitate them for Christian memory. And if you look here and there in art and in memory of the church, there are things we can restore and recover. They're just not up front. Everybody thinks of Peter and Paul. Remember the famous painting that's on all the books about the new book, The Parting of the Ways? Peter and Paul, Peter and Paul, Peter and Paul. That's not the list that I find in the New Testament. I find James